Void Miner, Guild of Stone, Part 4, Chapter 16, Old Wounds. The hub hummed around them, a low, constant vibration that seemed to seep into the bones. Kara leaned against the console, arms crossed, eyes tracing the faint flicker of light on the panels, but not really seeing them. She was aware of Arg moving through the narrow aisle beside her, methodical, precise. The faint sound of boots on metal, a counterpoint to the machinery's pulse. Weeks at the hub had given her a chance to observe him, to read the patterns of his movements, the small habits that betrayed more than he wanted anyone to know. He was disciplined, exacting, but not without weight. She had noticed the slight tension in his shoulders when the work was heavy, the way his hands sometimes hesitated before adjusting a panel, the pause before he spoke when a decision could mean life or death. She had long suspected the solitude he carried was a shield, but now she realized it was built over years of experience, forged in far more dangerous fires than the hub could ever simulate. "I need to ask," she said softly, letting her voice slice through the hum. "You've been here before. Not just the hub, not just mining disputes, but everything else. You've seen it all." Arg looked up, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to a panel. "I have," he said. "Collapses, equipment failures, rival crews, and worse. Politics, survival, decisions that don't leave anyone untouched. I've been through more than this hub could ever throw at us." Kara's chest tightened. "Not just the hub, huh?" she prompted. "Careful." He gave a short, dry laugh. "No, I was part of it. The Belt War. Nights in Zero G where every choice could mean a friend's life, where strategy and instinct merged into a single brutal rhythm. And yes, I led some of it. I made calls no one else could bear. I survived, others didn't. That's a burden that sticks." Kara's throat tightened. She had heard the stories in fragments. Helix had swept through her family, her crew, leaving her alone, drifting. She had always known, through whispers, through reports, that Arg had been at the center of that conflict, leading miners and factions into battles. She had never hated him, not really, but the weight of knowing, the intimate knowledge of his choices, had lingered silently in her mind. I I know what you did during the war," she said quietly, her voice low, almost reverent. "The choices, the battles, the lives you were forced to weigh against one another. I I've carried that too." Arg's eyes softened. He did not flinch, nor did he try to justify the past. "Every strike, every decision, every loss. I've carried it all. I survived, yes, but so did the echoes of those I couldn't save. And you survived your own losses, carried them through everything. I know that too." The weight of his words pressed against her chest. The hub hummed outside, indifferent. Outside, the belt moved on its endless cycle, fractured asteroids and drifting ships forming a chaotic mosaic. Inside, Kara felt the heavy presence of history, of survival, of shared trauma that neither could speak lightly about. "I've been careful," she admitted finally. "Careful not to let anyone in, not to expose weaknesses. Helix took my family, my crew. I kept moving to survive, to stay safe. But knowing who you are, knowing what you carried, it makes this talking almost impossible. And yet," her voice faltered, caught between memory and fear, "it it feels like I can." Arg's hands rested lightly on the console. "You don't have to carry it alone. Not now. Not if you let me." Her eyes traced the faint scars along his hand and forearms, evidence of a life lived in constant danger. "I've never said any of this aloud. Not the loss, The fear, the nights I thought I'd be the last alive. Not to anyone.
You are now, Ark said softly, steady, unwavering. I'm listening. That counts for something.
She swallowed, eyes misting slightly. I thought the armor of solitude would protect me, that it would shield me from further pain. But it hasn't. It only kept me careful. Too careful.
It kept you alive, Ark replied. That's what matters. Not untouchable, not invulnerable, just alive. You made it through everything the belt threw at you, and that takes skill, courage, and endurance.
Kara's chest tightened with a mix of relief and tension. The man before her, the one who had been at the center of the Belt War, who had led battles that had touched her life in ways both known and invisible, now offered no judgment, only acknowledgment. You really mean that? She asked softly.
I do, he said simply. And if you let me, you won't have to bear it alone anymore.
The weight between them shifted. For the first time, Kara let herself rest against the console, the hum of the hub and Ark's presence wrapping around her like a tether. She could trust him here. Not fully, not yet, but enough to let the shared understanding, the shared scars, breathe. I have carried so much, she whispered, and I thought it would harden me. Instead, it made me guarded.
Guarded can survive, Arg replied, but you can also grow. Letting someone in doesn't mean letting go of who you are. It just shares the weight.
Hours passed in quiet companionship, the hub alive with machinery, the faint clatter of distant crews, the occasional warning beep from errant drones. She watched him work, meticulous and steady, every moment disciplined, yet softened by the presence of someone who understood. And she realized something. Vulnerability isn't weakness here. It was a bridge, fragile, tentative, but real. You're not alone anymore, she whispered at last, voice low but firm, letting the words settle in the shared space between them. The hub continued its hum, indifferent, but the weight they carried together felt lighter, shared. Arg's lips twitched in a faint, almost imperceptible smile.
Good, he said. I'd hate to think I missed my chance to say that.
Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but full of presence. The two of them sat in parallel, side by side, in a world that had taken so much, finally letting the understanding between them form a bridge over old wounds. It was raw, honest, and unpolished, yet it was enough. For the first time in years, in a place full of reminders of war, loss, and survival, Kara realized she had someone who could truly share the burden. And Arg realized he wasn't alone in carrying the ghosts of his choices either. Chapter 17. Close Quarters. The Dust Widow hummed quietly against its docking clamps, tethered firmly to the bulk of the belt hub. Even in its stationary state, the ship seemed alive, every panel and conduit whispering a low vibration that Arg felt through the soles of his boots. The vast station beyond the viewport glimmered like a swarm of restless fireflies, lights shifting as massive cargo haulers and escort vessels threaded through the skeletal framework of the port. A low static from distant thrusters and docking clamps reverberated faintly through the hull, a reminder that nothing in the hub slept entirely. Arg leaned against the console, fingers tracing the faint scratches in the alloy surface, the worn edges a map of years spent alone in the ship. Kara was nearby, perched on a crate converted into a temporary workbench, her hair loose and untamed, cascading down her shoulders. She had been aboard for months now, fully aware of the widow's quirks, every narrow corridor, every cramped corner. She moved through the space with ease, a quiet grace that made the confines feel larger than they were. And yet, for all that familiarity, her presence unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was tapping at a portable console, fingers flying over the display, inputting logs, drafts, and sketches that would eventually form the backbone of the Miners Guild the station commander had requested they establish. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing faction disputes, drafting proposals, designing a rudimentary code of conduct, but necessary. The belt needed cohesion, someone to guide the miners out of the chaos and competing interests in scattered operations. And for some reason, the commander had decided that Arg and Kara, with their combined reputation and experience, were the ones to try.
You've reconciled the faction lists?
Arg asked, leaning over her shoulder, the narrow space forcing their bodies close. His elbow brushed hers, and he caught himself mid-step, a slight jolt running through him. Nearly, she replied without looking up, voice steady. I need to verify the last 3 weeks of resource allocations. Haulers keep moving supplies without logging them correctly. It's going to take some cross-checking, and then I'll draft a set of operational guidelines for them. Arg exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. The work was tedious, but it was also grounding. Years of hauling, mining, and surviving the belt's indifferent void had taught him to focus on concrete outcomes rather than politics. This was a step toward stability, toward something tangible for the miners who had no voice beyond the station announcements. He moved to the small galley, grabbed a cup of recycled water, and leaned against the wall near her.
We're going to have to get these factions talking to each other. That's half the battle. Once they trust the structure, the rest will follow.
She glanced up finally, eyes meeting his. There was a glimmer of acknowledgment, a slight arch of her brow that said she agreed, but wanted to see the proof first. Trust is built, not demanded, she said softly, and some of these miners have been burned too many times to hand it over easily.
Figures,
He muttered, taking a slow slip.
Then we build slowly.
For hours they worked, side by side in the galley, papers and data pads spread across the narrow table. The space was cramped. Every movement required conscious awareness of the other's position. Yet it was in this closeness, in the mechanical rhythm of their labor, that the subtle tension between them grew. Accidental brushes of hands, leaning over the same console, sitting too close to reach a datapad, all became part of the fabric of their daily lives aboard the Widow. Arg caught himself observing her more than necessary. The way her hair fell across her shoulders as she typed, the light catch in her eyes when she solved a particularly messy discrepancy, the faint curve of her smile when she realized two previously conflicting haulers had already begun informal communication. He didn't like the realization, but he couldn't ignore it. Her presence had become essential, more than he had anticipated. You're staring, she said suddenly, without turning. He froze, caught, then muttered.
I'm observing.
A laugh, light and unexpected, broke the tension. Observing, huh? That sounds like something a miner would claim when he's caught snooping. He grunted, moving to sit across from her, letting the table's small surface separate them just slightly.
Someone has to make sure you're not making mistakes.
Someone? She quipped, rolling her eyes. That's a lot of responsibility for a single miner. He smirked faintly.
I'm a meticulous miner. That counts.
Hours passed like that, punctuated by small, shared jokes and quiet conversations about minor operational logistics. Outside the hull, the hub continued its constant dance of machinery, lights, and noise. Inside, in the narrow confines of the Dust Widow, Arg and Kara were building more than logs and drafts. They were constructing a rhythm together, a pattern of coexistence that was beginning to feel like home. As the day drifted toward Hub's evening cycle, they gathered the logs and drafts to take them down to the station offices for review. The corridors between the docking bay and the station elevators were bustling with miners, haulers, and traders, all preoccupied with their own work. Arg and Kara moved efficiently, side by side, their coordination almost instinctive now. Each knew where the other would step, how close to come, when to pause to let someone pass. The shared space had become a silent teacher, guiding them into a comfort that was more than professional. Back aboard the Widow, the work continued. They sorted supplies, cleaned and recalibrated consoles, and repaired minor maintenance issues. Kara had an uncanny way of seeing potential problems before they become critical, noting subtle irregularities in data streams and physical checks. R contributed where he could, rerouting power to consoles, adjusting environmental controls, reprogramming logs for better clarity. Their skills complemented each other, technical, logical, precise, but the shared labor brought them together in ways neither fully acknowledged. One evening, while recalibrating the life support monitor in the cockpit, Ari accidentally brushed Kara's hand. The contact was fleeting, but it left a lingering warmth. He swallowed, focusing on the panel in front of him, heart racing slightly. She didn't comment, didn't pull back. She simply continued her work, her proximity normal, comfortable. The subtle intimacy of months of shared quarters had taught them both to navigate these small touches without fuss, but the effect lingered. After long hours, when the hub had quieted and the shadow of the station stretched long against the widow's hull, they sat together in the galley, sharing a simple meal. The food was recycled, bland, but it was theirs. Side by side, they spoke softly about the progress of the fledgling guild, draft regulations, proposed meeting schedules, tentative agreement with miners' foremans. The conversation was practical, necessary, but underneath it ran an undercurrent of personal awareness, a quiet acknowledgment of the months spent navigating each other's space.
I never expected it to be this complicated, Ark said, voice low. Trying to get them to listen, to trust. Everything's fragmented.
Kara nodded, sipping her water. It will take time. We're building something from scratch. No one's handed us a functioning guild. Every agreement, every compromise has to be earned. He studied her, noting the patience in her posture, the sharpness of her mind, the ease with which she had navigated both the logistics and the people. His chest tightened slightly. It wasn't discomfort in the usual sense. It was awareness, recognition of how much her presence mattered to him. Does it bother you? She asked suddenly, voice quiet.
Bother me? He echoed.
Being aboard the Widow all the time with me, she clarified, turning slightly so that he could see her profile. It's a small space. I don't want you to feel too crowded. He shook his head slowly.
No, it's different, not bothersome. Unsettling? Maybe, in that it's pleasant. I didn't think I'd feel this way.
Her lips twitched in a faint smile. Unsettling can be good, she said softly, returning her attention to the draft logs. Later, as the hub lights dimmed and activity slowed to the mechanical hum of routine, they returned to the bunks. The narrow quarters forced proximity, but by now they were accustomed to it, comfortable. Each movement, each small gesture, carried weight, but it was natural, unforced. Arg lay in his usual lower bunk, boots resting against the console, and watched Kara settle above him. The hum of the Widow vibrated through the bulkhead, through his body, through the subtle awareness that this space, the shared quarters, the narrow corridors, the constant closeness, had begun to matter more than he was ready to admit. Her hands brushed against his arms as she adjusted her position. He didn't flinch, didn't move away. The months of shared life had taught them both to navigate these small intimacies without comment, yet each touch carried significance. He exhaled slowly, settling into the quiet of the ship, letting the realization sink in fully. He was not alone anymore. The Dust Widow was no longer a solitary refuge. It had become a home of shared labor, shared space, and subtle, rising intimacy. And he liked it enough that the knowledge unsettled him, stirred thoughts he hadn't allowed himself to have for decades. The ship hummed softly around them, the hub faintly visible beyond the viewport, and in that quiet, Arg let himself feel it, the warmth, the presence, the partnership, the connection. He didn't need to define it. He didn't need to name it. He only knew that he didn't want it to end, that he wanted it to grow, quietly, naturally, in the confined humming heart of the Dust Widow. Kara, aware of his gaze, met it for a fraction of a moment, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. No words were necessary. They had lived together, worked together, built something in tandem with the fledgling beginnings of the guild, and in the process, something fragile and human had taken root in the narrow quarters of a battered mining vessel. And for the first time, in a long time, Arg let himself relax into it. Chapter 18. Quiet Pull. The hub's outer corridors were always busy, no matter the cycle. Cargo handlers shouted, loaders clanged, and the low thrum of engines drifted through the steel bones of the station. Kara had learned to ignore the constant noise, to narrow her focus until all she saw were the details of the guild she and Arg were piecing together. Yet sometimes, when she was exhausted from lists and disputes and broken data streams, the background chaos reminded her of the war, of the disorder left behind when the belt had torn itself apart. She carried that memory back with her as she stepped onto the Dust Widow, the docking seals sliding shut behind her. The transition from the hub's noise to the ship's quieter hum was always startling, like walking into a different world. The air was different here, slightly metallic, tinged with the faint odor of recycled filters and old machinery. It was cramped, narrow, undeniably utilitarian. But after months aboard, she had learned every turn, every corner. She had learned the widow the same way she was learning Arg, slowly, carefully, without asking for more than it was ready to give. Arg was in the galley, bent over the table, sleeves pushed up past his elbows as he scribbled across the data pad. His broad shoulders were hunched, his concentration fixed, a scowl carved into his face. He didn't notice her at first. That wasn't unusual. He often disappeared into thought, drawing lines and connections that seemed obscure until he explained them aloud. She lingered at the doorway, watching him, the muscles in his forearms flexed as he wrote, the scars along his knuckles catching the dim light. She knew those scars, had asked once, and he'd brushed the story off with a miner's grunt and a half-smile. She hadn't pressed. There were some wounds he wasn't ready to share, just as there were pieces of her past she hadn't voiced yet. Still, she found herself watching him more than she intended. The silence stretched long enough for him to finally glance up. His eyes met hers, and something tightened in her chest. He didn't speak, just looked at her, as though measuring her presence. The moment stretched until she forced herself to break it. "Commander wants the draft ready by next cycle," she said, stepping in. Her voice felt steadier than she expected. Arg nodded slowly, setting the pad aside.
"We'll have it. Just a matter of tightening the language."
She crossed the small galley and sat across from him, their knees almost brushing under the table. The widow wasn't designed for comfort. It forced closeness. Every surface was too small, every seat too near. At first, she had resented it, the way the ship offered no escape. Now it was different. The nearness wasn't confinement anymore. It was something else. They worked in silence for a time, reviewing draft clauses, adjusting phrasing, debating over terms like safety compliance and equitable access. Arg was blunt, practical, focused on results. She was precise, unwilling to let vague wording create loopholes. Together they built something coherent, a foundation for the guild to stand on. But beneath the work, the tension simmered. Every brush of his hand when he reached for a data pad, every moment when their shoulders leaned too close, it all lingered. She caught him watching her once, not the papers, not the table, but her. When she met his gaze, he didn't look away immediately. The weight of it stirred something low in her stomach, something she didn't want to name. She cleared her throat, turning back to the datapad. If we don't get the smaller fractions on board, the larger ones will see no point in participating.
Then we get the smaller ones first,
He replied, his voice low, steady. It won't be easy.
Nothing worth building ever is.
His words shouldn't have carried the weight that they did, but her pulse quickened all the same. She found herself staring at the scar near his temple, the one that curved just above his brow. She wondered how many times he had walked away from fights he shouldn't have survived, how many times he had carried scars without complaint. The ship hummed around them, a steady heartbeat in the silence. The widow wasn't empty anymore. It carried their words, their tension, their unspoken understanding. Later, after hours of revisions and recalibrations, she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. I need air, she murmured. Arg rose instantly, as though her words were a call to action.
Deck 5 observation ring?
She nodded. They left the widow and walked through the hub together, weaving through the crowds until they reached the quieter upper decks. The observation ring was half deserted, its wide windows opening onto the endless dark. Kara pressed a hand to the glass, staring out at the drifting asteroids and far-off glimmers of ships threading through the belt. Arg stood beside her, arms crossed, his presence grounding. She didn't look at him, not directly. She could feel him, though, the heat of his body, the steadiness of his breathing. It was enough to make her heart race. He broke the silence.
You've taken to the widow faster than most would. She's not an easy ship to live on.
She allowed herself a small smile. Neither are you. His laugh was quiet, rough, but genuine. The sound made her throat tighten unexpectedly. She glanced at him then, just for a moment. His eyes caught hers, and she couldn't look away. The pull was there, unspoken but undeniable. Long stares, quiet breaths, the weight of everything they hadn't said pressing close. She wanted to step closer, to let the silence resolve itself into something more, but she didn't. She forced herself to turn back to the stars, breaking the connection before it could deepen. Let's finish the draft, she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. She avoided his eyes as they turned back towards the widow. The pull was too strong, too dangerous. Desire had no place here, not yet. Not when the guild was still fragile. Not when her own scars still ached. Yet the silence between them hummed louder than the widow's engines, promising more than either dared to admit. Chapter 19. The Night. The hub was never truly quiet, even during the station's artificial night cycle, when the lighting dimmed and the storefront shutters clamped down over stalls. The air held a steady pulse of movement. Vents rattled, conduits hummed. Distant machinery echoed through bulkheads. Out beyond the docking spokes, tugs drifted slow arcs, guiding new arrivals into berths with lights that blinked like cold stars. But inside the Dust Widow, quiet had a different weight. The ship rested in its berth, as though holding its breath, lights dimmed to the soft amber glow, the hum of her life system the only heartbeat in the stillness. Arg sat at the galley table, an empty mug cupped in his hand, though the coffee inside had gone cold a while back. He hadn't been drinking it so much as holding it. The ceramic, warm once, now cool, grounding him while his thoughts wound circles he couldn't quite settle. Kara sat across from him, her back against the wall, legs tucked beneath her on the bench. She had a stack of tab sheets spread out in front of her, guild drafts, cargo tallies, rough meeting notes from the day. But she wasn't reading them anymore. Her eyes were turned sideways towards the narrow viewport, where only the edge of the hub's framework was visible, lattice metal crossing over the black void beyond. Neither of them spoke. It wasn't silence born of discomfort. It was something thicker, heavier, stretched taut between them. A silence filled by the fact that they'd said everything practical already. The meeting reports, the shift disputes, the next round of proposals to sort through. What remained unsaid now had nothing to do with the guild, or the hub, or politics. Arg shifted his mug and cleared his throat. The sound felt too loud in the small galley.
You're staring holes through the plating, he muttered.
Kara's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. And you're nursing that mug like it owes you answers. He snorted, shaking his head. The laugh was low, quiet, almost swallowed before it reached the air, but it lingered between them. Her gaze flicked to him then, catching his eyes. Not long, just long enough to tighten something in his chest. She looked away again before it grew into something that had to be named. The night stretched on. Arg found himself cataloging details he usually ignored. The faint crease at the corner of Kara's brow when she read, the way she absently traced her thumb along the edges of a data pad, the quiet sound of her breath steady in the hush of the ship. Months ago, he would have bristled at the intrusion of someone else in his space. The widow has been his sanctuary, his cage, his punishment. But now it didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like gravity. He caught himself staring and forced his gaze down at the empty mug again. His reflection ghosted back at him off the surface of the cold liquid. Tired eyes and a jaw set too hard. He thought of Tara unbidden, the way memory always ambushed him when he least expected. But it wasn't like before, not as raw. Tonight, the thought slid into something gentler, folded into the realization that Kara wasn't replacing anyone. She was simply there, in the now, with him, and he wanted her to be. The admission was a dangerous one. Kara closed her pad at last, stacking it neatly with the others. Too late to keep working, she said softly. Arg grunted.
Guild will still be here tomorrow.
She leaned her arms on the table, studying him. The amber light traced lines across her face, softening her features. There was something in her eyes, something that asked more than the words she'd spoken. He'd felt it, sharp and undeniable, pulling at him. You're quiet tonight, she said.
I'm always quiet.
Not like this. Her voice was steady, but her hands flexed against the tabletop, betraying nerves. Ark's throat tightened. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. He'd been through firefights, cave-ins, riots. He'd stared down Helix soldiers, men with rifles raised, void black tunnels caving in around him, and none of it had shaken him like the way she was looking at him now. Like she could see past the armor he wore, the distance he kept. Something shifted in the air, not a move, not a word, just a tilt, the kind of movement where one choice could tip everything. He stood first, pushing the mug aside, trying to buy himself distance.
Should get some rest.
But he didn't head for his cabin. He lingered, one hand braced on the back of the chair, the other tightening into a fist at his side. Kara rose too, slower, and the narrowness of the galley closed the space between them. They stood a step apart, the hum of the ship the only sound. Her eyes found his again. This time she didn't look away. Ark's chest rose, fell. He knew what he should do. Turn. Leave. Bury himself in the cold safety of solitude. That was always his answer. But the thought of walking away tonight felt impossible, like cutting off air. When she reached up, just slightly, fingers brushing the fabric of his sleeve, the contact was small, barely there, but it burned through him all the same. He didn't move at first, couldn't. Then slowly, deliberately, he let his hand cover hers, rough calluses against softer skin. He heard his pulse in his ears.
Kara,
His voice was low, rough, almost warning. I know, she whispered, and she did. The night unfolded in fragments. A step closer, the faint catch of breath, the heat of closeness after too many nights spent fighting it back. The widow's walls seemed to narrow further, pressing them together, until there was no distance left. Neither of them spoke. There was no declarations, no promises, only the surrender to what had been building for months, the pull that neither of them could deny any more. The galley lights dimmed further on the ship's night cycle, leaving shadows to blur edges, to soften. And at last, Arg let the walls he'd carried so long fall. Morning came with a thin spill of pale light through the viewport, bleeding across the galley's metal. The ship hummed the same as always, unchanged. Kara sat at the table again, hair loose, datapad idle in front of her. She wasn't reading it. Her eyes tracked the surface absently, unfocused. Arg emerged from the corridor slower than usual. He paused in the doorway, watching her. Neither spoke. The air was thick with something unspoken, something that didn't need words. What had happened in the night wasn't erased, but neither of them reached to define it. Arg crossed to the counter, poured himself a coffee, and sat across from her, the scrape of the chair leg against the deck louder than anything either of them wanted to say. Their eyes met briefly, then drifted away. The silence was companionable, different now, irrevocably changed. And though no words passed, both of them knew. Chapter 20. Quiet Consequences. The hub's recycled air always carried the faint tang of metal, like someone had scraped filings into the ducts and the system never quite managed to filter them out. Kara had grown used to it these past months, an aftertaste of survival, she thought, the flavor of station that clung to life out here in the belt. This morning, or whatever passed for it, given the hub kept station, time that meant nothing to her body. She was already awake before the lights cycled up. She'd slipped from the narrow berth aboard the Widow, her movements careful, quiet. Arg hadn't stirred, or if he hadn't said a word. That was fine. Words weren't what last night had been about. Still, she felt the warmth of it lingering under her skin. Even now, as she sat at the galley table with a tin mug of bitter coffee clutched in her hands. She wasn't used to this, waking with a memory that both settled and unsettled her. They hadn't spoken of it afterward, and maybe they wouldn't. Out here, in close quarters, you learned not to poke at things too hard. The widow's galley was hardly more than a corner, bulkhead plating dulled by years of use, a fold-out table scarred with cuts and burns, two mismatched chairs welded back into service after accidents that would have sent them to scrap anywhere else. She liked it. It was unpretentious, solid. It felt more honest than the hub's glossy upper decks with their political chatter. Her fingers curled around the mug tighter as she stared at nothing in particular. Thoughts drifted, circling. The guild, the commander's expectations, the way miners from rival claims had actually started coming to them with disputes instead of settling it with their fists. Progress, yes, but fragile. And then there was Arg. Always Arg, even when she told herself she was focused on the work. The hatch slid open with its usual grind of gears needing grease. Heavy boots followed. She knew the sound of his step instantly. She didn't look up right away. Just sipped her coffee and let the moment stretch. Arg stepped into the galley, shoulders filling the doorway, as though the ship itself had to make room for him. He had that half-rumpled look he always carried when sleep hadn't been kind. His hair was mussed, the old scars on his cheek roughened by stubble, eyes narrowed like he'd been thinking too hard since before waking. He stopped short when he saw her already sitting there. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, the faint hum of the life support fans loud in its stead. Then his brow furrowed, that half-suspicious, half-curious expression she'd come to recognize.
"You're up early,"
He said, voice low, gravelly from disuse. She shrugged, keeping her tone casual. Couldn't sleep. His gaze flicked to the mug in her hand, then to the second chair. After a moment, he moved forward and lowered himself into it, slow as if testing the chair's welds again. His big hands rested on the table, calloused knuckles scarred from years in rock and steel. The silence that followed wasn't the same as it used to be. Before, it would have been thick, uncomfortable. But now, it felt different, like a quiet they both accepted, maybe even welcomed. Finally, Kara tilted her mug towards him. Coffee still hot. Want some? Art grunted, then reached across for the pot she'd set near the heater. He poured himself a mug, black and steaming, and took a swallow without flinching at the bitterness. For a while, that was all they did. Drink and sit, each letting the ship's hum fill the space words might have gone. Kara caught herself watching him, how the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when he squinted into his mug, how he braced himself unconsciously, like even sitting was a kind of battle. She looked away quickly, heat rising in her chest. It shouldn't feel this different, and yet it did. The rest of the day unfolded in the hub, but with a subtle shift she couldn't quite put her finger on. They worked side by side through reports of broken lifts, pressure leaks, small claims disputes, all the endless little things that made up the bones of a station trying not to collapse in on itself. Kara spoke more easily than before. She found herself making small jokes at Ark's expense, things she wouldn't have dared weeks ago. To her surprise, he didn't snap back or bristle. Sometimes he even smirked, a rare softening of his hard edges. Other times, he just looked at her with that quiet steadiness that unsettled her far more than anger ever had. When they walked the hub's corridor, checking on crews or speaking to shift leaders, she noticed the space between them had narrowed. Before, Arg had kept a distance, always angled slightly away, as though holding something in reserve. Now, though, his stride matched hers, her shoulders sometimes brushing in narrow walkways. He didn't pull away, neither did she. It wasn't spoken, not once. They didn't need to. That evening, back aboard the Widow, Kara sat again at the galley table, working through logs of the day. Arg leaned over the console opposite her, his large hands moving with a surprising precision as he adjusted figures, cross-checked repairs, and logged disputes that had been settled. Their words were simple, functional, but beneath them ran that same undercurrent. Something changed, something warmer, something she felt in every glance they didn't quite hold. At one point, she brushed past him to reach a data slate on the far side of the table. Her hand brushed his arm. Just a moment, accidental, but enough. Her breath caught, her pulse quickened, and she saw him freeze for the briefest instant before moving again, as though it hadn't happened. They didn't speak of it. But later, when the logs were finished, and Arg pushed himself back from the console with a weary sigh, Kara lingered. She watched him stand, stretch his shoulders, the lines of fatigue in his posture. Something in her chest tightened, and she smiled, not for him to see, but for herself, because she knew, whatever last night had been, whatever they chose to call it, or not call it, it had changed something between them. Quiet consequences, subtle but undeniable. And for the first time since she'd stepped onto the station, she felt the ground under her feet was more solid than shifting. The end of Void Miner, Guild of Stone, Part 4.